He thought he was targeting a powerless nobody, but this black man was actually a powerful judge. What happens next shatters the racist cop's arrogance and delivers justice you won't forget. The city of Rivertown buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Car horns blaring, coffee shops overflowing with tired workers, and the rhythmic hum of commuters rushing to their destinations. Amidst this familiar hum, one figure stood out. A tall black man, impeccably dressed in a navy suit and tie, walking toward his car in the courthouse parking lot. His name was Judge Marcus Reed, a respected legal mind and a trailblazer in his community. But today, Marcus wasn't in his courtroom. He was simply running errands after a long week on the bench. As he opened his car door, the sound of screeching tires shattered the morning calm. A police cruiser pulled up abruptly, blocking Marcus's path. Two officers stepped out. One of them, a stocky middle-aged man with a smug grin, immediately sizing Marcus up, as if he'd already made up his mind about him. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked, his voice sharp, his eyes narrowed. Marcus froze, stunned by the sudden aggression. His heart raced as he raised his hands slowly, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions brewing inside him. He knew exactly what this was. This wasn't just a routine check. This was something else entirely, something far too familiar. "Sir, what's going on?" Marcus asked, his tone measured but firm. "Don't play games with me," the officer snapped, stepping closer. "We've got reports of suspicious activity in the area, and you fit the description." Marcus blinked, his mind racing. He knew he didn't fit any description, unless, of course, the description was simply black man. But he also knew that challenging the officer here, in this moment, could escalate things dangerously. "I'm just on my way to the grocery store," Marcus explained. "I work right across the street at the courthouse." But the officer wasn't listening. He was already reaching for Marcus's wallet, which was tucked neatly into his suit pocket. Without asking permission, he snatched it out and flipped it open. "What's this?" the officer sneered, holding up Marcus's ID. "A judge, huh? You think that means you're above the law?" The other officer, a younger man with an uncertain expression, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should double-check this, Officer Grayson," he muttered, his tone hesitant. Grayson shot him a look. "I don't need to check anything. Guys like him always think they can weasel their way out. Not today." Marcus felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, a lesson she'd drilled into him since he was a boy. Always keep your composure, no matter how unfair the world seems. It's the only way you win. Still, as Grayson slapped handcuffs on his wrists, twisting them too tightly, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how many other men, good, honest men, had been humiliated like this, simply for existing. His stomach churned as onlookers stopped to stare, their expressions a mix of pity and discomfort. "Is this really necessary?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "Oh, it's necessary," Grayson replied smugly, shoving Marcus toward the squad car. "You want special treatment. You're not getting it here." As Marcus sat in the back seat, his hands bound, he glanced out the window at the courthouse, a building he had spent years working in to deliver justice. The irony wasn't lost on him. Today, he wasn't the one upholding the law. Today, he was just another target of its abuse. Little did Officer Grayson know, the man he had just humiliated wasn't going to let this moment pass quietly. Justice wasn't just Marcus's profession, it was his purpose. And today, justice was coming for Grayson in ways he could never imagine. The ride to the police station was suffocating, the silence broken only by the crackle of the police radio and the occasional muttered remark from Officer Grayson. Marcus sat in the back seat, his wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs, his mind racing. He'd spent his career fighting for justice, but now he was the one caught in the crosshairs of injustice. And for what? The color of his skin. His heart ached at the thought of how many others had endured this same humiliation, their stories never told, Their voices silenced. Grayson glanced at Marcus through the rearview mirror, his smirk smug and unrelenting. "You know," he said with mock casualness, "guys like you always think you're untouchable. Fancy suits, big titles, they don't mean squat on my watch." Marcus looked at him evenly, his calm composure masking the storm within. "And what exactly do you mean by guys like me?" Grayson scoffed, feigning ignorance. "Don't twist my words. You know exactly what I mean." The younger officer in the passenger seat shifted uncomfortably again. "Grayson," he murmured, "maybe we should—" "Quiet, rookie," Grayson snapped, cutting him off. "I know what I'm doing." Marcus didn't say another word. He had learned long ago that silence could be just as powerful as words. His gaze remained steady, a quiet defiance that seemed to rattle Grayson more than he let on. When they arrived at the station, Marcus was pulled out of the car and escorted inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Grayson paraded him through the precinct like a trophy, drawing curious glances from the other officers. Some whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Marcus and Grayson. It was clear they recognized Marcus, but none of them dared to intervene. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. Grayson slammed Marcus down into a chair near the booking desk, leaning in close. "So, Judge Reed, what's it like to be on the other side of the law? Not so high and mighty now, huh?" Marcus didn't flinch. "You should be careful, Officer Grayson," he said quietly, his voice steady. "You're about to make the biggest mistake of your career." Grayson laughed, the sound sharp and grating. "Oh, is that a threat? You think you can intimidate me?" Newsflash, your title doesn't mean anything here. Before Marcus could respond, a commanding voice cut through the room. "What in the world is going on here?" The room fell silent as Captain Sarah Caldwell, a seasoned officer with years of service under her belt, stepped forward. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene, landing on Marcus. Recognition flickered across her face, and her expression darkened. "Judge Reed." Grayson straightened up, his smirk faltering for the first time. Captain, we brought him in for questioning. He was acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" Captain Caldwell interrupted, her voice icy. "Do you even know who this man is?" Grayson's face turned red, but he tried to recover. "He said he's a judge, but—" "He is a judge," Caldwell snapped. "Not just any judge. He's one of the most respected legal minds in the state. And you brought him in on what? A hunch?" Grayson stammered, struggling to find his footing. I thought—" "That's exactly the problem," Caldwell said, her tone sharp. "You didn't think." She turned to Marcus, her expression softening. "Judge Reed, I am so sorry for this misunderstanding. I assure you this is not how we operate." Marcus met her gaze, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Captain Caldwell, I appreciate your apology, but I think we both know this was more than a misunderstanding." Her shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of his words hitting home. She knew he was right. This wasn't just about one rogue officer. It was a reflection of a deeper issue, a culture of bias and unchecked power that had festered for too long. Grayson opened his mouth to protest, but Caldwell silenced him with a glare. "Officer Grayson, my office, now." As Grayson slunk away, Caldwell turned back to Marcus. "Please allow me to make this right." Marcus stood, his wrists still cuffed. "The best way to make this right," he said, his voice steady but firm, "is to ensure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Caldwell nodded, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "I'll see to it." By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the incident, with headlines splashed across TV screens and social media. "Racist cop arrests, black judge by mistake." Video clips of Marcus being paraded into the station in handcuffs circulated widely, sparking outrage. Comments poured in, some expressing anger, others sharing their own stories of injustice. The community was furious, and demands for accountability grew louder with each passing hour. Marcus stood in his living room, phone in hand, scrolling through the messages flooding his inbox. Lawyers, activists, even old friends he hadn't spoken to in years were reaching out. Some offered support, while others urged him to press charges or use his platform to expose systemic racism in law enforcement. His mind was still processing the whirlwind of events when his younger sister, Angela, arrived. She burst through the door, her expression a mix of worry and anger. "Marcus, what the hell happened? I saw the video, and I can't stop shaking." Marcus offered her a faint smile and gestured for her to sit. "It's exactly what you think it is. I was walking to my car, and suddenly, I'm suspicious." Grayson didn't care who I was, Angela. To him I was just nothing. Angela's eyes brimmed with tears. "You're not nothing. You've worked so hard to get where you are, and still they see you as a threat." Marcus placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know. That's why this can't just be about me. It has to be about every person who's been treated like this, but didn't have a title to protect them." Angela wiped her tears, determination flickering in her eyes. "So what are you going to do?" "I'm going to fight," Marcus said firmly. "Not just for myself, but for everyone who doesn't have a voice in these situations." That afternoon, Marcus held a press conference outside the courthouse. A crowd had gathered. Reporters, community leaders, activists, and everyday citizens, all eager to hear what he had to say. Cameras clicked as Marcus stepped up to the podium, his expression calm but resolute. "Good afternoon," he began, his deep voice cutting through the chatter. "Yesterday, I was wrongfully arrested by an officer who saw me not as a man, but as a stereotype. I was humiliated, treated as though my humanity didn't matter. And while I wish I could say this was an isolated incident, we all know that isn't true." The crowd murmured in agreement, the weight of his words resonating with everyone present. "I stand here today not just as a judge," Marcus continued, "but as a black man who knows what it feels like to be judged unfairly. Yesterday, I was able to walk out of that station because of my title. But what about the countless others who don't have that privilege? Who speaks for them?" His voice grew stronger, more impassioned. "It's time for real change. Change in how we train our officers, change in how we hold them accountable, and change in how we treat the communities they are sworn to serve. Racism and bias have no place in our justice system, and they certainly have no place in our police departments." The crowd erupted into applause, but Marcus raised a hand to quiet them. "This is not just about calling out injustice. It's about doing the hard work to fix it. That's why I'm calling for an independent review of the Rivertown Police Department, starting with Officer Grayson and anyone else who enabled his behavior." As the cheers grew louder, Marcus took a step back, his heart pounding. He had never been one for the spotlight, but he knew this moment was bigger than him. This was about sending a message that change was not only possible but necessary. Back at the precinct, Captain Caldwell watched the press conference on a small TV in her office. She felt a pang of shame, but also a flicker of hope. Marcus's words were a wake-up call, and she was determined to act on them. She picked up the phone and dialed the mayor. "Mayor Whitfield," she said when the line connected. "We need to talk about police reform. Now." Meanwhile, Officer Grayson sat in a dimly lit interrogation room, the once arrogant smirk now replaced by a look of panic. Internal Affairs had already launched an investigation into his record, and the findings were damning. Multiple complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and abuse of power. His days as an officer were numbered, and deep down, he knew it. Marcus's press conference had lit a fire under the entire city, and now the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. But Marcus knew this was just the start. The real fight, changing the culture and policies that allowed officers like Grayson to thrive, was still ahead. Weeks had passed since Marcus's wrongful arrest, and Rivertown was no longer the same. The city had become a focal point for national discussions about racial bias and police reform, with Marcus at the center of it all. His story had inspired countless people. but it had also placed an enormous weight on his shoulders. Sitting in his office late one evening, Marcus stared at his desk. It was covered with stacks of papers, letters from people sharing their own stories of injustice, proposals for reform, and invitations to speak at forums across the country. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion creeping in, but he couldn't stop now. This was bigger than him, and he knew it. A knock at the door broke his train of thought. Angela stepped in, holding a cup of coffee. "You've been at it all day," she said, her tone gentle but concerned. "You need to take a break." Marcus gave her a tired smile. "I'll rest when this is done." She sat across from him, her expression softening. "I know you feel like the whole world is counting on you, and maybe they are, but you can't do this alone." Marcus nodded slowly, the truth of her words settling in. He wasn't alone. The community had rallied around him, and so had people from across the country. If change was going to happen, it would take a collective effort. At Rivertown Police Department, change was finally underway. Officer Grayson had been officially terminated after the internal investigation revealed years of misconduct. Captain Caldwell, true to her word, had implemented sweeping reforms. Mandatory bias training was instituted, and a new oversight committee, composed of community leaders, legal experts, and police officers, was created to review complaints and hold officers accountable. One of the first members of that committee was Marcus himself. Though he had been hesitant at first, Caldwell had convinced him that his insight and perspective were invaluable. "If we're going to fix this," she had said, "we need people like you who are unafraid to speak the truth." The precinct wasn't perfect. No institution could change overnight. But progress was being made. Younger officers, inspired by the recent events, began to speak up more frequently, calling out behavior they once would have ignored. Even Caldwell admitted that Marcus's arrest had been a turning point, forcing everyone to confront the biases they had allowed to go unchecked. On a cool Saturday morning, the city of Rivertown held a community event in front of the courthouse. The crowd was larger than anyone had anticipated, spilling into the streets. There were booths from local organizations, speeches from activists, and performances by local artists, all centered around the theme of justice and unity. Marcus stood backstage, adjusting the microphone pinned to his jacket. His stomach churned, not from nerves, but from the overwhelming sense of responsibility he felt to the people who had come to see him. He stepped onto the stage, greeted by thunderous applause, and took a moment to let the energy of the crowd settle. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady, but full of emotion. "Thank you for being here, for standing together, and for believing that we can create something better." He paused, scanning the faces before him, young and old, black and white, police officers and civilians. What happened to me was not unique. It was part of a pattern, a system that has been broken for far too long. But this movement isn't about pointing fingers. It's about building bridges. It's about creating a system where justice truly means justice for everyone. The crowd erupted into applause, and Marcus waited patiently for the noise to die down. "We have a long road ahead. There will be setbacks, and there will be days when it feels like we aren't making progress. But I promise you this, we will not stop. We will not give up." Because the stakes are too high, Angela watched from the side of the stage, tears streaming down her face as the crowd chanted Marcus's name. She had always known her brother was strong, but seeing him inspire so many people filled her with pride she could barely contain. As the event wrapped up, Marcus stepped off the stage and into the crowd, shaking hands, hugging supporters, and listening to their stories. A young boy approached him, barely 8 years old, clutching a handwritten note. "Judge Reed," the boy said shyly, "my mom said you're a hero. I want to be like you when I grow up." Marcus knelt to meet the boy's gaze, his voice warm and kind. "You can be whatever you want to be. Just remember, kindness and courage will take you far." That evening, As Marcus walked home, the city felt different. The streets that had once carried a shadow of division now seemed brighter, filled with hope. He knew the fight wasn't over. Racism and injustice couldn't be eradicated in a day or a year. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years: optimism. Because one moment of injustice had sparked a movement for change, and that movement was just getting started.